She was a broken baker drowning in debt. He was a cold, untouchable heart surgeon, but when fate forced them to meet again after 5 years of silence, secrets were revealed, and nothing would ever be the same. Hello, my friends. Before we begin this amazing story, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and how your day is going, all right? And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. The rain over London was not the gentle, poetic mist that sold postcards. It was a relentless, weeping grey that soaked into the very mortar of the city, turning vibrant streets into muted watercolor washes. In a corner of Notting Hill, where chic boutiques and Michelin-starred bistros fought for prominence, the sweet beginning was slowly drowning in that same pervasive dampness. The patisserie, Ilara Reid's fiercely loved, desperately fragile dream, felt more like an end than a beginning. Through the large front window, fogged by the contrast between the autumn chill outside and the frantic heat within, Ilara was a study in solitary motion. At 29, her movements, once fluid and joyful as she piped intricate rosettes onto a cake, had become sharp, brittle, with an exhaustion that had settled deep in her bones. The air inside, a thick concoction of vanilla, almond, and the faint, acrid tang of burnt sugar from a batch of caramel she'd neglected for a moment too long, was the scent of her ambition curdling into anxiety. It clung to her clothes, her hair, a constant cloying reminder of the mountain of debt represented by the unopened, cream-colored envelopes shoved beneath a £50 sack of flour. Every empty table in the small, charmingly decorated shop was a fresh wound, a silent testament to her failure. This fear of failure was a beast she knew intimately, a creature born from a much deeper, unhealed laceration from 5 years prior, a love that had not just ended, but had simply vanished, leaving a void of unanswered questions and the chilling certainty that she was someone who could be left behind without a word. Her fierce independence was the scar tissue, tough and unyielding, but the terror of being abandoned again, this time by her own dream, was a constant throbbing ache beneath the surface. In stark contrast, Dr. Alistair Finch's world operated without the messiness of emotion or the unpredictable chaos of burnt sugar. His universe, just a few miles away in a sleek Kensington flat, was one of controlled lines, polished chrome, and sweeping panoramic views of the city that seemed to lay itself at his feet. At 34, he was a titan in his field, a name whispered with a mixture of reverence and fear in the hallowed corridors of the Royal London General Hospital. As one of its most sought-after cardiologists, his life was a testament to sterile precision and disciplined excellence. His mornings began not with the warm, unpredictable bloom of yeast, but with the cool, silent hum of an espresso machine that delivered the exact same perfect shot every time. His interactions were as minimalist and controlled as his living space. His diagnoses were scalpel sharp, his manner clipped and devoid of unnecessary sentiment. He had built a fortress around himself, its walls constructed from professional accolades and an unbreachable emotional distance. This armor had been forged in the fire of a family tragedy years ago, a catastrophic event that had ripped away his sense of control and taught him that vulnerability was a synonym for pain. He moved through the world with the deliberate, detached grace of a surgeon in the operating theatre, keeping everyone, from colleagues to patients, at a safe, clinical arm's length. He was admired for his brilliance, but he was not loved, and that was exactly how he had designed it. His personal life was a carefully guarded enigma, a blank space that no one dared try to fill, protecting a core of fragility he was convinced would shatter upon. Exposure. The first thing to pierce the thick fog of unconsciousness was not a thought, but a smell. It was the sterile, biting scent of antiseptic, a smell so alien to her world of butter and chocolate that it felt like an assault. The second was a sound, the steady rhythmic beeping of a machine that seemed to mock the frantic arrhythmic fluttering of her own heart. It was a cruel metronome, counting out the beats of her failure, each chirp a reminder that she had pushed her body past its breaking point, collapsing onto the cold, unforgiving tiles of her own bakery floor. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over Ilara as she slowly pieced together the fragments of reality. She was in a hospital bed, the crisp white sheets a stark contrast to her flour-dusted work clothes. A kindly but weary-looking nurse had just finished checking her vitals, her voice a soft murmur of professional reassurance. "You gave us quite a scare, love. Collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration, it looks like. Dr. Finch will be in to see you shortly. He's the head cardiologist, the best we've got." The words were meant to be comforting, but they only intensified Ilara's shame. The head cardiologist. Another bill she couldn't afford. Another person to witness her spectacular implosion. She closed her eyes, wishing she could disappear into the thin, starchy pillow. Then the door swished open with a soft hydraulic sigh, and the world stopped turning. Dr. Alistair Finch walked in, and the sterile, anonymous hospital room was suddenly charged with 5 years of unspoken history. His posture, the confident set of his shoulders beneath the immaculate white coat, radiated an authority that was a universe away from the memory she clung to. A younger man in a worn corduroy jacket, his lopsided grin illuminated by the dappled sunlight of Kew Gardens as he read poetry aloud, his voice a low, melodic rumble that had felt like home. The shock was a physical force, a silent detonation in the small room that seemed to suck all the air from her lungs. For a single shattering second, the formidable mask of Dr. Alistair Finch crumbled, and in its place was Ali, the boy she had loved with an all-consuming fire, his eyes wide with the same stunned recognition that was ricocheting through her own chest. The air between them crackled, thick and heavy with the ghosts of shared laughter, whispered secrets, and the brutal, tearing silence he had left behind. It was a moment stretched thin, a fragile membrane of shared memory that was just as quickly punctured by his retreat. He recovered with the speed and precision of a surgeon correcting a slip of the blade. The warmth, the shock, the boy, it all vanished, subsumed by a chillingly professional composure. His gaze dropped from hers to the chart in his hand as if it were a shield. "Miss Reed," he said, and the name, so formal and foreign, was a slap. His voice was the instrument she had dreaded, cool, clinical, and utterly detached. "I'm Dr. Finch. It appears you've had a severe syncope episode, likely brought on by prolonged stress and dehydration." He didn't look at her as he spoke, his focus instead on the sterile data of her blood pressure and heart rate. The chasm between their two worlds had never been so starkly, cruelly illuminated. Her life of chaotic, passionate, flower-dusted creation was now just a case file, a set of symptoms to be diagnosed and managed by the very man who had shattered her heart and disappeared without a trace. He tried, with a discipline bordering on pathological, to maintain that professional boundary. His visits were brief, efficient, and strictly medical. He would enter the room with a crisp, "Good morning, Miss Reed," ask a series of targeted questions about her symptoms, dizziness, palpitations, fatigue, and listen to her heart with a stethoscope that felt colder than ice against her skin. He never met her gaze for more than a fleeting, impersonal moment. He was Dr. Finch, a brilliant and detached physician, and she was case number 7B, a patient with a stress-induced arrhythmia. Yet, beneath the sterile surface of their interactions, a current of unspoken tension flowed, a silent conversation composed of averted eyes and tight-lipped professionalism. Alistair found himself battling an internal insurgency. The controlled, orderly world he had so meticulously constructed was being threatened by the woman in that bed, a woman who was supposed to be a ghost. He had expected to find her broken, a fragile echo of the vibrant girl he had known. Instead, he saw a warrior. Her resilience was a quiet, stubborn flame that his cold detachment could not extinguish. It began to methodically, relentlessly dismantle his defenses, brick by painful brick. He saw her not just as a patient, but as Ilara, and the recognition was a dangerous, unwelcome complication. The true turning point came during one of his late-night rounds, long after the hospital had settled into a hushed quiet. He hadn't intended to check on her again, but an invisible force seemed to pull him towards her room. He paused at the door, peering through the small glass window, expecting to see her asleep. But she was awake, propped up against the pillows, the glow from a small bedside lamp illuminating her face in a soft halo. She wasn't watching television or reading a magazine. In her hands, she held a stack of cheap paper napkins from the hospital cafeteria, and she was writing with a fierce, concentrated energy, a pen clutched in her fingers like a weapon. He pushed the door open a silent inch, his curiosity overriding his professional caution. He could see then what she was doing. On one napkin, she was sketching intricate diagrams of multi-layered entremets and delicate sugarwork. On another, she was scrawling columns of figures, costings for ingredients, projected profit margins, staffing schedules. It was a business plan, a defiant manifesto of survival being drafted. From a hospital bed, a profound, unsettling admiration bloomed in his chest. The woman he had abandoned out of a coward's fear, the woman he had convinced himself he was protecting from his own inadequacy, was facing financial and physical ruin with a spirit so indomitable it humbled him. He, with all his success and control, had run from a challenge, while she, with nothing but debt and a failing dream, was preparing to charge back into the fight. This newfound, grudging respect began to manifest in small, hesitant gestures that felt like breaches in his own fortress. The next morning, after his formal rounds were complete, he found himself walking not to his office, but to the small staff kitchen on the cardiac floor. He meticulously prepared a cup of tea, his movements sure and automatic, guided by a memory he hadn't realized he still possessed. Earl Grey, a splash of milk, no sugar. He remembered how she used to hold the mug with both hands, warming them, her eyes crinkling. At the corners, as she inhaled the scent of bergamot. He carried the cup to her room and left it on her bedside table while she was sleeping, a silent, anonymous offering. When Ilara awoke to find it, a wave of confusion washed over her, followed by a hot surge of anger. Only one person had ever known exactly how she took her tea. The gesture was too specific, too intimate. It was a crack in his clinical facade, a whisper of the man he used to be, and it infuriated her because it threatened the neat, clean lines of her anger. She wanted to hate the cold Dr. Finch. It was far easier than contending with the ghost of Ali. She resisted, fortifying her defenses with sarcasm and clipped one-word answers during his visits. But the quiet, persistent care continued, subtly chipping away at her resolve. The chasm between them was bridged, unexpectedly, during a more detailed cardiac examination. Alistair was explaining the nature of her arrhythmia, the chaotic rhythm of her heartbeat, and he began with the standard medical jargon: premature atrial contractions, supraventricular tachycardia. He saw the confusion and fear clouding her eyes and stopped abruptly. A flicker of an old instinct, the desire to explain the world to her in a way she would understand, broke through his professional veneer. He paused, his gaze dropping to his hands for a moment before meeting hers. "Think of it like tempering chocolate," he said, his voice softer than she had heard it since he'd walked through her door. "You have to heat it and cool it to precise temperatures. The rhythm of the process is everything. If the rhythm is wrong, if you rush it or falter, the crystal structure doesn't form correctly. It becomes brittle, fragile. It loses its shine." He had spoken her language. He had taken a complex medical concept and translated it into the art and science of her own world. It was a stunningly intimate analogy, a moment of profound and unexpected connection that silenced the Beeping machines and the sterile hum of the hospital. For the first time, he wasn't Dr. Finch, and she wasn't Miss Reed. They were just Ali and Ilara, standing on opposite sides of a wound, with a shared memory of tempered chocolate glistening between them. His quiet, relentless care was beginning to feel less like a doctor's duty and much more like a penance. An unspoken apology he seemed compelled to perform, one cup of perfectly made tea at a time. Their fragile, unspoken truce, however, was a delicate ecosystem, unsuited for the harsh, judgmental climate of the Royal London General Hospital. It was immediately threatened by external forces, chief among them Dr. Isabel Vance. Sharp, impeccably dressed, and fiercely ambitious, Isabel moved through the cardiac ward with the predatory grace of a shark sensing blood in the water. She was a colleague of Alistair's, and it was an open secret among the staff that her professional admiration for him was tinged with a more personal, unrequited interest. Isabel embodied the rigid class and professional hierarchies of their world. She saw medicine as a pure empirical science and viewed patients as complex biological puzzles to be solved, not as messy, emotional human beings. From her perspective, Ilara Reed was a dangerous anomaly, a shop girl whose chaotic personal life represented a contamination of the sterile environment Alistair was supposed to command. Isabel's observations were as sharp as her intellect, and she quickly noticed the subtle shifts in Alistair's behavior, the extra visits to room 7B that weren't on the official schedule, the way his attention lingered on Ilara's chart longer than necessary, the teacup that would appear on the bedside table long after the morning beverage cart had made its rounds. Each detail was a data point, and the data was pointing to an unnerving conclusion. The unflappable Dr. Finch was becoming compromised. The hospital corridors, with their polished linoleum, floors and hushed efficiency, became a breeding ground for gossip. Whispers followed Alistair like a shadow, nurses exchanging speculative glances as he passed. "Have you seen him with the woman in 7B?" one might murmur to another over the charts at the nurses' station. "He's never spent this much time with a syncope case before." The narrative began to write itself. The brilliant, emotionally unavailable head of cardiology, inexplicably drawn to the pretty, penniless baker. It was a story that fed the hospital's voracious appetite for drama, and it cast Ilara in the role of a siren, a distraction luring a great man towards the rocks of professional impropriety. The external judgment reached a chilling crescendo with the brief, unscheduled appearance of Alistair's mother, Eleanor Finch. A formidable woman from a long line of decorated physicians, she carried an air of old-money aristocracy that felt entirely out of place in the public ward. She swept into the hospital lobby like a queen visiting a remote and slightly distasteful colony, her disapproval a palpable force. Her visit with Alistair was brief, conducted in a hushed but steely tone in a corner of the hallway, but her parting glance towards Ilara's room was as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. Her message was unspoken but clear. His association with a person of Ilara's station was a stain on the family's legacy. This pressure from his family, a silent but immense weight, added another layer to Alistair's. Internal conflict, reminding him of the world he belonged to and the world Ilara represented, and how they were never meant to intersect. The simmering conflict boiled over one afternoon. Ilara, finally allowed out of bed for a short walk, had felt a sudden wave of dizziness in the hallway. Her breath hitched, and a familiar panic began to rise in her throat as her heart started its frantic, chaotic dance. Alistair, who had been reviewing charts nearby, saw the color drain from her face. Without a second's thought, his professional protocols vanished, replaced by a purely human instinct. He was at her side in an instant, his hand reaching out to steady her, his other arm moving to support her back. "Easy," he murmured, his voice low and urgent, all clinical distance gone. "Breathe with me, Ilara, just breathe." At that exact moment, Dr. Isabel Vance rounded the corner. She stopped dead, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. Alistair Finch, the untouchable cardiologist, holding his patient with a tenderness that was anything but clinical, his voice using her first name with an unguarded familiarity. For Isabel, this was not a doctor helping a patient in distress. It was a gross, professional breach. A moment of damning vulnerability. She saw the confirmation of all her suspicions, and more than that, she saw an opportunity to remove a rival for professional accolades, to excise a social contagion from her orderly world, and to reinforce the rigid code of conduct that Alistair had, in her eyes, so recklessly abandoned. Her judgment was swift and merciless. As she turned and walked away, a thin, triumphant smile touched her lips. She was no longer just an observer. She was an architect, already designing the scaffolding for a public and professional humiliation that would be as precise and devastating as any surgical procedure. The first blow landed the following afternoon. Alistair was summoned to a sterile, intimidating conference room to meet with the hospital's chief administrator and the head of the ethics committee. The air was thick with a funereal gravity. Acting on a formal complaint filed by Dr. Isabel Vance, detailing a pattern of unprofessional conduct and compromised patient-doctor boundaries, the hospital board had made a swift decision. He was being suspended, effective immediately, pending a full ethics hearing. His career, the meticulously constructed edifice that had become his entire identity, was suddenly hanging by a single fraying thread. The terms of his suspension were brutal and explicit. He was forbidden from setting foot in the hospital except for his own hearing, and most critically, he was to have absolutely no contact with the patient at the center of the complaint, Ilara Reed. She, the woman he was just beginning to see again, the woman whose resilience had started to cauterize a wound in him he didn't know was still open, was now his chief liability. The news hit him not like a scalpel, but like a sledgehammer, shattering the cool composure he had worn for years and exposing the raw, panicked nerve beneath. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed his own humanity for, was about to be stripped away because of a single moment of instinctual kindness. That night, the minimalist perfection of his Kensington flat felt like a prison. The sweeping city lights, once a symbol of his success, now seemed to mock him, each twinkling light a reminder of a world that was closing him out. He paced the polished floorboards, a caged animal, the administrator's cold words echoing in his ears. He was cornered, facing professional annihilation, and the weight of it was suffocating. But beneath the fear for his career was a deeper, more agonizing dread. The thought of Ilara alone in that hospital room, learning of his suspension from a nurse, believing the whispers, believing that he, once again, had simply abandoned her. The thought was unbearable. In a decision born of pure desperation, he broke protocol. He drove back to the hospital, using a service entrance he knew would be unattended, and took a maintenance elevator to the roof. He sent Ilara a single cryptic text from a blocked number. "Rooftop, now, please." The wind on the roof was cold and biting, a physical manifestation of the desolation in his soul. When Ilara finally appeared, a borrowed coat pulled tight around her hospital gown, her face pale and etched with confusion, the sight of her broke something open within him. The dam of 5 years of secrets and shame finally burst. There, under the indifferent London sky, he delivered the devastating revelation that had torn them apart. His voice, when he finally spoke, was raw, stripped of all its clinical authority. "My father," he began, the words catching in his throat. "You remember I told you he was a surgeon?" She nodded, her eyes searching his, trying to understand. "The week I was supposed to meet you, the week I disappeared, he had a stroke, a massive, catastrophic stroke, right in the middle of a triple bypass surgery." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were filled with the ghosts of a pain she had never known. "He survived, but his right hand, his entire right side, it was gone. The greatest surgeon of his generation, a man who built his entire identity on the precision of his hands, couldn't hold a fork. He was a legend, and overnight he became an invalid, trapped in his own body, raging at the world. He paced the cold concrete, the words spilling out of him, a torrent of confession. I was just a resident. I was suddenly responsible for everything. The finances, the round-the-clock care, his reputation, and his shame. He couldn't stand anyone seeing him weak, and I couldn't stand it either. I looked at him, this broken giant, and all I could see was my own future. I was terrified. Utterly, completely terrified that I wasn't enough, that I would fail him, that I was an imposter. And I looked at you, happy and brilliant and full of this incredible light, and I knew I would extinguish it. I couldn't bring all that darkness into your world. I couldn't let you see me fail. He stopped in front of her, his breath misting in the frigid air. It was easier to be a ghost to you, he confessed, the words ripped from the deepest, most guarded part of his soul, than to be a failure in front of you. The twist was complete, a perfect agonizing circle. His past wound, his inability to fix his father, was now inextricably linked to his present crisis. He hadn't just run from her, he had run from the reflection of his own deepest fear, a fear he was now being forced to confront all over again. The confession hung in the frigid night air between them, a fragile, shimmering thing that seemed as vulnerable to the biting wind as they were. Ilara stared at Alistair, at the man he was now and the boy he had been, trying to reconcile the two. The story he had just told was a devastating counter-narrative to the one she had written for herself over the past 5 years, a story of cruel, inexplicable abandonment. In its place was a tragedy of a different kind, one of fear, shame, and a young man crushed by a weight he felt he had to bear alone. The initial shock gave way to a complex, churning sea of emotions. There was a profound, aching empathy for the terrified resident he had been, watching his hero crumble. But beneath that was a sharp, persistent sting of betrayal, not of her love, but of her strength. She finally found her voice, and it was steadier than she expected, though laced with the chill of the wind and years of hurt. A single phone call, Ali. A letter. A text message. Anything. You owed me that. You owed us that. Her words were not an accusation, but a simple, painful statement of fact. Why didn't you tell me? Did you really think so little of me? Did you think I was so fragile that I would break under the weight of your truth? That I wouldn't have stood by you, that I wouldn't have fought with you? He flinched as if she had struck him, because her questions landed precisely on the rotten core of his failure. No, he whispered, his voice hoarse. It wasn't about you, Ilara. That's the tragedy of it. I thought it was about protecting you, but it was about protecting myself. I was a coward. He looked out over the sprawling, indifferent city, its lights a cold constellation below them. My father defined himself by his strength, his perfection. When that was gone, he was filled with this terrifying rage at his body, at the world, at me for being whole when he wasn't. I was drowning in it, and I was so afraid of becoming him. I thought that kind of despair was a disease, and I couldn't bear the thought of infecting you with it. I chose to be a ghost because I didn't know how to be a man. The raw honesty of his words was disarming, stripping away the last vestiges of the arrogant Dr. Finch and leaving only the scared, broken man he had been hiding for years. The silence that followed was different now, no longer charged with unspoken anger, but filled with a heavy, shared sorrow. He had not just lost her, he had lost a version of himself, a path he was too afraid to walk. Ilara pulled the borrowed coat tighter around herself, a futile gesture against a cold that was coming from within. She didn't have the answers he was so desperately, silently seeking. Forgiveness wasn't a switch that could be flipped. I need to think, she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. She turned and walked back toward the door to the stairwell, leaving him alone on the rooftop, suspended between a past he had finally confessed and a future he had almost certainly destroyed. The atmosphere in the hospital the next morning had shifted from one of quiet professionalism to a buzzing hive of hushed speculation. Ilara felt the change the moment she stepped out of her room for a mandatory walk. The nurses, who had previously been a source of brusque comfort, now either offered her looks of cloying pity or averted their gazes entirely, as if her situation were contagious. She was no longer just a patient. She had become a story, a piece of gossip being traded over lukewarm coffee in the break room. She felt like an exhibit, her personal collapse now a public spectacle. The experience was profoundly isolating, reinforcing the feeling that her life was something happening to her rather than something she was in control of. Her solitude was broken by a soft knock on her doorframe. Dr. Isabel Vance stood there, a vision of tailored professionalism, her face arranged in a mask of sincere concern. "Miss Reed, Ilara, I hope you don't mind. I just wanted to see how you were holding up through all this." Isabel glided into the room, her presence sucking the warmth from the air. "I want you to know that I am so terribly sorry that you have been put in this position. It's dreadfully unfair. Alistair, he has a brilliant mind, truly one of the best, but he sometimes allows his personal feelings to cloud his judgment. It has always been his greatest flaw." Isabel perched on the edge of the visitor's chair, her posture radiating a predatory stillness. Her words were carefully chosen, each one a polished stone, dropped into the quiet pool of Ilara's room. "The board, you understand, their only concern here is for patient welfare. They have to ensure that no one has been taken advantage of in a vulnerable state. When they call on you to speak at the hearing, all they will want is your honest account of what happened. They need to know that you felt safe, that no lines were crossed." The subtext was as clear as the view from Alistair's Kensington flat. "Help us secure his conviction, and you will be seen as the blameless victim. You will be protected." Ilara looked at this sharp, ambitious woman, at her perfectly manicured nails and her cold, calculating eyes, and she felt a surge of anger so pure and clarifying it burned away her confusion. She saw Isabel not as a concerned colleague, but as a puppeteer, attempting to pull the strings of a narrative that would benefit her own career. Isabel's concern was an insult to Ilara's intelligence and a complete erasure of her agency. Ilara offered a small, tight smile. "Thank you for your concern, Doctor. I'm sure the board and I will have a very productive conversation." The polite dismissal, devoid of the gratitude or emotional fragility Isabel had expected, caused a flicker of surprise in the other woman's eyes, before her mask of sympathy slipped perfectly back into place. When Isabel left, the room felt colder than ever, but Ilara's resolve had been forged into something hard and unyielding in the chill. Her newfound determination was tested later that day by a visit from two men in impeccably tailored suits. One introduced himself as a representative from the hospital's legal department, the other as the lawyer Alistair's family had retained. They were a formidable team, their combined presence filling the small room with an aura of expensive corporate power. They were polite, smooth, and their strategy was unnervingly unified. "Miss Reed," the hospital lawyer began, his voice a soothing baritone, "we want to make this process as painless as possible for you. Our primary goal is to ensure the integrity of this institution and the well-being of our patients." Alistair's lawyer took over seamlessly. "And our goal is to mitigate the damage to Dr. Finch's career, which has been exemplary until this point. We believe there is a path forward that serves both our interests." He leaned forward slightly, his expression one of earnest confidence. "The simplest, cleanest narrative is this. You were under extreme physical and emotional distress. Dr. Finch, burdened by a past connection, allowed his professional judgment to be compromised by his concern for you. He overstepped. It was a lapse, an error born from a misguided sense of duty. If you can attest to feeling overwhelmed, perhaps even confused by his attentions, the board will see him as a man who made a mistake, and you as the patient he failed to properly protect. No one will assign you any blame. It will be over quickly. They were handing her a script, a pre-packaged story in which she was cast as the damsel in distress, a fragile creature whose only role was to be vulnerable. Ilara listened to their proposal. Without interruption, her hands resting on the thin blanket covering her lap, her gaze drifted to the bedside table, where the stack of napkins covered in her frantic, hopeful scrawls still sat. She saw the diagrams for her new signature creation, a lemon and lavender entremet, and the carefully calculated profit margins for a wholesale contract she hoped to land. That stack of napkins was the testament to her will, the evidence of her fight. These men, in their clean suits and with their clean narrative, wanted to erase all of it. They wanted to reduce her to a passive object in a story about a brilliant man's fall from grace. The contrast between their version of her and the woman who had spent the last 5 years clawing her way toward a dream, who had literally worked herself to the point of collapse in its pursuit, was not just jarring. It was a profound insult. To accept their story would be to agree that she was weak. It would be the ultimate betrayal of the very spirit that Alistair, in his own flawed way, had seen and admired from her bedside. A quiet strength, born of righteous indignation, settled over her. She looked from the lawyer's expectant faces to her makeshift business plan and back again. She knew with absolute certainty what she had to do. She would not be a character in their story. She would be the author of her own. Alone again in the suffocating quiet of the room, Ilara felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The relentless beeping of the monitors, the sterile smell, the pitying looks. It had all been a fog, obscuring her from herself. Now, the fog was lifting. She carefully gathered the napkins from her bedside table and spread them across the pull-out tray. They were stained with coffee rings and tear marks, flimsy and disposable, but to her they were sacred texts. This was the story the lawyers wanted to ignore. The story of a woman who, at her lowest point, did not wait to be rescued, but began, with ink and desperation, to rescue herself. She thought of Alistair's confession on the rooftop. He had run because he was afraid of being a failure in front of her. The irony was devastating. Now these lawyers were asking her to perform a similar act of cowardice, to present a weaker, more palatable version of herself to save him. She realized then that the only way to truly heal for both of them was through a radical act of honesty. Not the curated, strategic honesty of the legal team, but the messy, but powerful truth of her own experience. She would not be his accuser, nor would she be his victim. She would simply be a witness to her own resilience, and in doing so, she would redefine the entire hearing. The next few hours were a blur of focused activity. She asked a nurse for paper, a proper pen, a stapler. She began to transcribe her notes, organizing her pastry diagrams, her financial projections, and her marketing ideas into a coherent presentation. The hospital tray became her desk, the bland room her new office. She was no longer a patient waiting for a diagnosis. She was a CEO preparing for the most important board meeting of her life. While Ilara was forging her testimony from napkins and resolve, Alistair was adrift in the sterile silence of his own making. The Kensington flat, once his sanctuary of order and control, now felt like a gilded cage. The suspension letter lay on his polished marble countertop, its official letterhead a stark monument to his ruin. Every tick of the minimalist clock on the wall was a countdown to the end of his career. He was completely unmoored, stripped of the title and the white coat that had served as his identity for his entire adult life. Without the structure of rounds, consultations, and surgeries, the hours stretched before him, vast and empty. He thought about calling his father's private nursing facility, to hear his dad's slurred, angry voice, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. The shame was too immense. He had not only failed to live up to his father's legacy, but he had actively disgraced it. His fear had come full circle. He had become the failure he had always dreaded being. He was staring into the abyss of who he was without the validation of his profession, and he found nothing there. He was a hollow man, a collection of prestigious awards and publications that now meant less than nothing. His isolation was shattered by a phone call, the caller ID flashing a name that made his stomach clench. Eleanor Finch. He let it ring 4 times before answering, steeling himself. His mother's voice was exactly as he'd expected, cold, clipped, and dripping with disappointment. "Alistair, I have spoken with the family's lawyers. They seem to think this situation is manageable, provided the girl is sensible." There was a pause, laden with meaning. "I warned you. I warned you what happens when you involve yourself with people from that sort of world. They bring chaos. Your father built a legacy of unimpeachable excellence, and you have dragged it through the mud over a shop girl." Each word was a precisely aimed dart, striking the most vulnerable parts of him. "I hope, for all our sakes, that you have learned your lesson." She disconnected without saying goodbye, leaving a profound silence in her wake. The conversation left him feeling smaller, younger, like the boy who could never quite measure up. He sank onto a leather sofa that offered no comfort, replaying the rooftop scene over and over in his mind. He had laid himself bare, confessed his deepest shame to Ilara, and in return, she had given him only silence and uncertainty. He had no idea what she would say at the hearing, what she truly thought of him now. He had surrendered his pride, his last shield, and was left utterly powerless, waiting for a verdict not just from the hospital board, but from the only woman whose judgment had ever truly mattered. The great Dr. Finch, the master of control, had lost it completely and was now at the mercy of a fate he could no longer orchestrate. The hearing room was designed to intimidate. A long, imposing mahogany table gleamed under recessed lighting, reflecting the stern, impassive faces of the hospital's ethics committee. It was a sterile, airless space where careers were dissected and reputations were dismantled with polite, bureaucratic precision. Alistair sat beside his lawyer, a man whose expensive suit couldn't conceal the nervous tension in his jaw. Stripped of his white coat, Alistair looked diminished, a ghost haunting the scene of his own execution. Across the room, Dr. Isabel Vance sat in the observers section, a model of professional decorum, but her eyes held a glint of triumphant certainty. The proceedings began with the dry, methodical reading of her formal complaint by the hospital administrator. The words, "inappropriate emotional investment," "compromised professional boundaries," "potential patient exploitation," filled the room, each phrase a carefully placed nail in the coffin of Alistair's career. His lawyer then stood to offer a defense that was technically proficient but emotionally vacant. He spoke of Dr. Finch's unblemished record, his countless lives saved, his contributions to cardiac research. He framed the incident as an unfortunate but understandable lapse in judgment, a consequence of a distant, pre-existing acquaintance. Alistair listened to this sanitized, soulless version of events and felt a profound sense of self-loathing. This defense was just another form of hiding, another lie designed to protect a reputation that no longer felt like his own. Then, Ilara was called to speak. A palpable shift occurred in the room as she walked to the podium. Every eye was on her, the board members leaning forward slightly, expecting the tearful, halting testimony of a victim. But Ilara was not crying. She was calm, her posture poised, her hands steady as she placed a sheaf of papers on the lectern. She met the gaze of the chairman, a formidable older man named Dr. Albright, and began to speak, her voice not loud, but so clear and resonant that it commanded the complete attention of everyone present. "My name is Ilara Reed," she started, her tone even and direct. "And I am the owner of a patisserie in Notting Hill, or I was. A few weeks ago, I collapsed. The reason I was brought to this hospital was not just dehydration or a cardiac arrhythmia. The underlying condition was hopelessness. I had worked myself to the brink of existence in pursuit of a dream, and I was losing. My business was failing, my spirit was failing, and finally, my body failed too." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the silent room. There was no self-pity in her voice, only a frank accounting of her reality. She was not the person the lawyers had described. She was a woman laying bare the truth of her struggle, and in doing so, she was already beginning to dismantle their entire narrative. "In the hospital," she continued, "I was a case file, a set of symptoms. My despair was not on any chart, but Dr. Finch saw it." She glanced at Alistair, a fleeting but powerful connection. He did not cross a line. He opened a door. When he spoke to me about my heart, he used an analogy about tempering chocolate. He spoke my language. In that moment, he wasn't just treating my heart. He was reminding me who I was. I wasn't just a patient with a faulty heartbeat. I was a creator, an artist, a woman who understood the delicate balance of science and passion. She then picked up her papers, the transcribed notes from the hospital napkins. "This is the result of Dr. Finch's unprofessional care." She held them up. "This is a revised business plan, a strategy for a new menu, a set of financial projections that charts a path not just to survival, but to success. I wrote this from my hospital bed because his care, which you are calling into question, did not make me feel vulnerable. It made me feel seen. It did not compromise me. It empowered me. He didn't just stabilize my symptoms. He treated the root cause of my illness. He reminded me how to fight." Her testimony was a quiet bombshell. She had taken their clinical, legalistic framework and shattered it with the undeniable truth of her own human experience. She had not come to defend a doctor. She had come to claim her own story of healing, and in doing so, had offered a more profound defense than any lawyer could have conceived. Watching her, Alistair felt a cascade of emotions so overwhelming it almost brought him to his knees. Awe at her courage, a deep, gut-wrenching shame at his own past cowardice, and a wave of gratitude so profound it felt like grace. Her strength, her refusal to be defined as a victim, was the most powerful indictment of his own fear he had ever witnessed. While his lawyer had tried to save his career, Ilara had, in a few breathtaking minutes, saved his soul. As she finished and returned to her seat, the room was suspended in a stunned silence. His lawyer shot him a frantic warning glance that screamed, "Don't you dare say a word, she's given us an opening." But Alistair could no longer stay silent. Hiding was the disease that had brought him to this point. He stood up slowly, his movement drawing every eye. He did not look at the board. He looked only at Ilara. "She's right," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he made no attempt to conceal. "Everything she said is the truth, but it's not the whole truth." His lawyer's face paled. Alistair finally turned to the impassive faces of the committee. "The complaint filed against me is valid in spirit, if not in detail. I did fail to maintain an appropriate professional distance, but that failure did not begin a few weeks ago in a hospital room. It began 5 years ago, when I committed an act of profound personal cowardice." The confession poured out of him, raw and unscripted. He told them about his father, the legendary surgeon, and the catastrophic stroke that had shattered their family. He spoke of his own suffocating fear, of his shame, of his inability to cope with the fall of his hero. "I was in love with Ilara Reed," he stated, the words a simple, powerful admission in the sterile room. "And I ran from her. I vanished without a word because I was terrified of her seeing the failure I felt I was. For 5 years, I have hidden behind my profession. I built a wall of accolades and clinical distance to protect myself from ever feeling that helpless, that human again. He took a deep breath, his gaze finally finding Isabel Vance, whose face had become a mask of cold fury. My misconduct was not in caring for my patient. My misconduct was a lifetime of running from the very vulnerability and compassion that she, in her incredible strength, has just demonstrated. I failed to maintain distance, not because I sought to take advantage of Miss Reed, but because I was finally, after years of hiding, forced to confront the man I had failed most grievously, myself. Whatever your decision, it is long overdue. He sat down, his body trembling slightly, feeling more exposed and yet more whole than he had in his entire life. He had sacrificed his pride, his reputation, everything he had used as a shield, and for the first time, he felt truly free. The boardroom was utterly still. Ilara's testimony and Alistair's confession had transformed the hearing from a procedural inquiry into a profound exploration of what it truly means to heal. They had presented the board with an unimpeachable truth. A patient was thriving, and a doctor had been brought to a point of radical self-awareness. Dr. Albright, the chairman, removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a very human gesture in the inhuman space. He looked from Ilara's composed face to Alistair's exhausted but resolute expression. He looked at Dr. Vance, whose triumphant smirk had dissolved into a tight line of disbelief and rage. Her neat, orderly case had been ruined by the messy, unpredictable truth. After a brief, whispered consultation with the other members, Dr. Albright cleared his throat. "In light of the testimony from both Miss Reed and Dr. Finch," he announced, his voice carrying a new weight of consideration, "this committee finds that while certain professional boundaries were unconventionally navigated, the primary duty of care resulted in a profoundly positive patient outcome. The formal complaint is dismissed." He looked directly at Alistair. "A formal letter of reprimand regarding hospital communication protocols will be placed in your file. Do not let it happen again, Doctor." It was over. As the board members began to gather their papers, a quiet exodus began. Alistair's lawyer patted his shoulder, muttering, "I don't know how, but we did it." Across the room, Alistair's and Ilara's eyes met. There were no words, no smiles, just a deep, silent acknowledgement that passed between them. A recognition of the shared battlefield and the fragile, hard-won peace that had just been declared. A bridge built of truth and courage had finally been built over the ruins of their past. 6 months later, the relentless London grey had given way to the soft golden light of a late spring afternoon. On that same corner of Notting Hill, where a dream had once been dying, a new one was flourishing. The sign above the door, painted in a cheerful, elegant script, read, "The Second Chance." Inside, the patisserie was everything the sweet beginning had aspired to be, and more. It was bright, warm, and alive with the happy chatter of customers and the intoxicating scent of fresh coffee, browned butter, and melting chocolate. The muted colors of Ilara's past had been replaced with vibrant splashes of cerulean blue and sunny yellow. Ilara herself was transformed. She moved through her bustling state-of-the-art kitchen, not with frantic exhaustion, but with the graceful, confident artistry of a maestro conducting a symphony. A genuine, easy smile touched her lips as she gave instructions to her small team of bakers, her face glowing with a radiant peace. Tucked away on a small shelf near the front counter, nestled between jars of artisanal jams, sat a worn, well-loved copy of a poetry book, no longer a painful relic of a ghost, but a quiet, foundational stone marking the start of her journey. The bell above the door chimed, and Alistair stepped inside. He was not wearing a crisp suit or a doctor's sterile white coat, but a simple, soft grey sweater and jeans that made him look younger, more approachable. In his hands, he carried a large wooden crate filled with fresh, glistening strawberries from a farmer's market. He met Ilara's gaze across the crowded room and gave her a small, quiet smile. There was no grand announcement of his arrival. He simply navigated his way through the tables to the kitchen, found an empty space at a stainless steel prep table, and began to methodically hull the berries, his movements precise yet relaxed. He was a silent, supportive presence in her world, a seamless part of its new and beautiful rhythm. Hours later, as the last customer departed and Ilara flipped the sign on the door to closed, a comfortable quiet settled over the shop. She began wiping down the counters, the familiar motion a soothing end-of-day ritual. Alistair came up behind her, his arms sliding around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested, his chin on her shoulder, and together they looked at their reflections in the large front window, which was now a dark mirror reflecting the warm, golden lights of the bakery, creating a soft halo around them. "Ready for our sweet beginning?" he whispered, his voice a low, gentle rumble against her ear. Ilara leaned back into his embrace, her body relaxing into his, a real peaceful smile spreading across her face. The story that had begun with a collapse on a cold, unforgiving floor, in the heart of a lonely, desperate struggle, had found its end here in the warmth of a shared dream, a powerful, silent testament to their mutual redemption and the quiet, extraordinary strength of their second chance.